Right. Hello, everybody. I'll just see if this is going to be starting soon. Make sure the stream's working. I'm not sure about the latency on this one. It should be normal, apparently, which means I'll say something and about 10 minutes later it's going to come up. So let's have a look. There we go. Okay, well, hello everyone. Welcome to the third live stream for A-Level Politics. We're doing it slightly different this time. All we're going to do is in a presentation format, so I'm not spending too long writing things. So everything is already planned out and written out as we go along. Okay, I've also got a number of articles and a number of videos and a number of extra points for people to go into more further reading if they want to, boost their knowledge. And the aim really, and I'll link these in the chat as they go along, and the aim really is to, as we are planning these questions and discussing the kind of evidence that you can use, I'll be posting things in the chat, and then you can add those posts to your notes so you can have more information. That's the point, because it's, a live stream format's very good for discussing the kind of things we can talk about, and the kind of questions and the kind of ways in which you will answer it. But what's really not very good with live streams is that we can't go into as much detail as we'd like, because we've only really got an hour to go over these things. Secondly, these are at a different time. I used to do them about 1 o'clock. Now we're doing them at 4 o'clock, just to make up for the fact that schools have now reopened following lockdown, so we can actually get people in later on in the day. And thirdly, what we're going to do is we're going to break up the stream into different sections, and then upload those sections separately, just so we have just so it's easier for people to get access to the specific video they want to look at. So let's start with the first point. We're going to just go over what we're going to do in this stream, and then we're going to get on with it, because we are running slightly over. So we're going to look at two specific questions in this stream. They're both UK politics specific. We're not going to be covering any other stuff. In the next stream next week, we're going to do political ideas, only political ideas. I'm just going to keep filtering these in and out. Okay, make sure that, yeah, there we go. Make sure everything's going well. And again, I'll link a number of important resources throughout in the chat. So the first question, and I'm going to start recording if that works. Yes, it does. Okay, so the first question is, to what extent are compulsory voting and lowering the voting age the best ways to improve participation in the UK? That's the question. It's quite a nice question, and what we're going to do is we're going to ask ourselves 2 points. We're going to ask, what is this question doing, and then we'll get into actually how to answer it. What are we being asked with this question? And really, how we answer this question is, it's effectively asking us, what are the factors that we could do to increase participation in the United Kingdom, in political participation in the UK. That's what we're being asked. And you're being asked about the different factors. And you can think of different ways to increase participation in the UK, and we're going to talk about them in a minute. And really, you're not just going to have to discuss just the pros and cons of compulsory voting and lowering the voting age. You're also going to be asked to produce examples of other ways in which you can get people engaged in politics. You have to engage with other potential factors, which is what we're going to do. So we're going to split this into two, like always. On the one hand, compulsory voting and lowering the voting age are the best ways to increase participation in the United Kingdom, and then on the other hand, they're not the most important ways to increase political participation in the United Kingdom. And the first point we're going to look at is that compulsory voting would enhance legitimacy of election officials. Okay, this is the first point. One of the arguments that are generally made when we're talking about politics and political elections is, to what extent do the officials, the people that we have in power, to what extent do they have a mandate? Do they have a mandate for what they're doing? That's really the question. Do they have a mandate? And the question really is, does compulsory voting, if we introduce a compulsory voting system, then everybody would have to vote, and so therefore whoever wins this election, once everybody has voted, whoever wins the election will effectively have a higher mandate to put into place the policies that they want, because everybody voted for them. And you can look no further than the concept of the link between a higher electorate, a higher turnout of people, and a higher mandate. Look no further than the rhetoric surrounding Brexit. How many times was the rhetoric surrounding Brexit linked to the concept of 17.4 million voters? 17.4 million voters. And the point around this was that because 17.4 million voters voted for Brexit, therefore they have a higher mandate. It has a higher mandate, so we have to put in place provisions to actually leave the European Union. And so, therefore, the argument would go that compulsory voting will enhance the legitimacy of the electoral officials of governments. Whoever wins an election with the highest vote, with a turnout of up to the high 90%, because effectively you have got a compulsory voting. Therefore, they have a higher mandate to put into place the policies that are doing well. What's happening here? Something's happening with the stream. Hang on. Apparently the stream is buffering slightly. I am sorry. Hang on, let me work this out. Let me just sort this out for everybody. Oopsie daisy. Let me just go past the advert. Now, we don't want people okay, let me just sort this out. Hang on. Okay, let's see if that's done anything. Let's see if we're back. Let's hang on, let me wait for it to catch up. Let's wait for it to catch up, everybody. Yes, right. Okay, we're back. I'm not sure what that was, but stream's now good again. That's all that matters. Okay. Right. So let's carry on. So what we were talking about the higher mandate for officials who are in power. Another argument to suggest that compulsory voting is a good idea is that some would take the view that in a democratic representative democracy, a vote might not be just a right to vote, but you also may have a duty to vote, and therefore, if it's a duty to vote, then you have this kind of almost a moral a moral duty to have compulsory voting. So in a system, a theoretical system where you have a duty to vote under a representative democracy, you might say that is enough an argument to have compulsory voting, and we will talk about the counterpoints to these as well as we go on. I've just put a link in there to one of the first pieces of first piece of extra reading you can look at, which is a electoral knowledge network article on the practice of compulsory voting. Is voting a right or a duty? So it's a very good thing to look at for extra reading. You've got another point that when we're talking about lowering the voting age, one thing that would mean is that would increase the franchise. The franchise. Now, the franchise refers to the amount of people who are eligible to vote, the voting franchise. And so, therefore, if you want to increase more people's participation in politics, a very good argument is just allow more people to be able to vote. Therefore, lowering the voting age to 16 is a good example of how to do that. Okay. You can also talk about the ways in which lowering the voting age would increase young people's participation in politics. Now, this is a very good point, because if you have a whole new demographic of younger people who are now eligible to vote, that increases their participation in politics, because they will be able to vote, and that's a very good way to participate in politics. But it'll also increase the way in which politicians interact with young people. At the moment, there's very little direct interaction between a politician and somebody under the age of 18, because they have no incentive to enact policies that would be beneficial to them, only by way of their parents, for example. But if you have so many 16 and 17-year-olds being able to vote, then the argument could be that politicians would have to start caring about young people's issues a little bit more to try and win those votes. And so it would become a two-way streak. Not only would it increase participation by young people being able to vote, but it will also allow for politicians to participate, to allow for politicians to engage with young people more within an electoral process. Now, can anyone give an example of how lowering the voting age in the UK has been seen as a good thing? There isn't a specific example. There is a very specific example of where the voting age was lowered, and it's generally seen as being a positive thing. Okay, if no one can give the example, I'll say it in a minute. Anyone can give me an example? Well, the example would be the Scottish 2014 independence referendum. In the Scottish independence referendum in 2014, the voting age was reduced from 18 to 16, and this was just generally because it was a Scottish National Party's policy to generally reduce voting age for all elections in Scotland. Okay, and so therefore we have an example of voting age in Scotland being reduced, and the sky didn't fall down. Nothing bad effectively happened. The election went off just normally, and nothing really went wrong. So these are the arguments you can make in favour of the proposition that compulsory voting and lowering the voting age are good ways, or at least good ways to increase participation in the UK. You could make the argument that while they're not necessarily the best ways to increase participation, they are nonetheless very good ways of increasing participation. But in order to make that argument, you would have to list the reasons why they were good. Okay, you would have to then look at the counter arguments to establish why they're not the best, because they're only good, they're not the best, and then you have to bring in another factor to increase participation and argue why that factor is better than the two factors that we're talking about in this question. So that's how you would tackle that one. So let's look at the counter argument. The counter argument being that compulsory voting and lowering the voting age are not the best ways to increase participation in the United Kingdom. And there are a number of ways in which we could make arguments here. Okay, so a very important one is that while lowering the voting age may increase the franchise, it might not necessarily increase the turnout. Okay, and I'm going to direct us to a YouGov article on that as well. So we've got this in here. And what this really is trying to tell us is that the franchise refers to the number of people that are just eligible to vote in an election. Okay, so we can increase it and decrease it, by allowing different people to vote and not to vote. But that doesn't necessarily affect how many people are going to vote. If the number of people, if 16 and 17-year-olds, turned out to vote at a similar rate to 18, 19, 20, etc., then the turnout wouldn't actually increase, because we're increasing the ceiling effectively. We're not increasing, anything else. We're not increasing the turnout. So that could be an argument to suggest that it doesn't actually increase participation. But the counter argument to this would be that even though the turnout might not necessarily increase, even though the percentage of voters, the actual percentage of voters that are eligible to increase per capita, even though that wouldn't increase, the absolute number of people would increase. Because if you increase the number of people that can vote, then you're going to increase the number of people that will vote. So you can go back and forth with that, and that's what they talk about a little bit in that YouGov article. It will increase the number of people who can vote, okay, and so therefore that would still increase the number of people who will vote, assuming that some students who are 16 or 17 will vote. So that's the argument that you can go back and forth on in this case. You could say that lowering the voting age may wouldn't necessarily affect turnout, but it will still affect the absolute number of people who can vote. Scotland 2014. Yes, I mentioned Scotland in 2014. We looked at the if we go back here, what we have here is examples of lowering the voting age in the United Kingdom. I've linked the Wikipedia page to Scotland there. It was based as an example of lowering the voting age, and so therefore allowing for 16 and 17-year-olds to vote. Turnout increased to 75%-ish. Well, the argument in that respect was to what extent did the allowing 16-year-olds cause a 75% turnout rate? it could have just been the case that Scottish independence was, a very important factor within Scotland at the time. So that's the point there, because on average, generally speaking, you would expect younger people, 16 and 17-year-olds, to turn out at a lower rate than people who are who are a lot older. So therefore, some would argue that turnout would actually decrease if you have 16 and 17-year-olds turning out to vote. That's the argument that is made there. Okay. We could make the argument as well that, do we really have a duty to vote? Because within a representative system, some would argue that people have a duty to vote, and this is what we looked at when you have the pros and cons of compulsory voting, which I'm going to link here. The pros and cons of compulsory voting. Does it necessarily suggest that we have a duty to vote? Because doesn't your duty to vote also imply your duty not to vote? Which is a very interesting point that you could make. So does your duty to vote imply your duty not to vote? That's the argument you could make. Okay? And you could counter that as well. Oh, hang on, we won't counter that in a second. We'll talk a bit more about this. So, does your duty to vote imply that you have a duty not to vote as well? What if you just don't feel any particular connection to a particular candidate in an election? Or what if you are just generally politically neutral or not interested in politics at all? Does that mean that you have to be forced to do this thing that you don't want to go and do? Because if I'm, somebody who isn't particularly affiliated with a political party, for example, then should I have to be forced to go down to the polls and vote for somebody who I don't particularly like? Now, what would be the counter argument to that point? If I was to say that a duty to vote means that I have to go and vote for somebody that I don't like, what could you say as a counter argument to that point? What counter point could you make? I'm going to let it give it a couple of minutes just to let it catch up, let the stream catch up. Because there is a very good counter argument that you could make. Can anyone guess? If I was to say, I don't want to have to vote because I don't want to have to vote for a particular candidate. So the question is, if I have a duty to vote, and if voting is compulsory, if I have to go and vote, what happens if I'm just somebody who doesn't affiliate with any party? Should I have to go and vote for a particular person even though I don't want to? Should I have to align myself with a political candidate if I'm not not necessarily very political, or if I just don't like any of the candidates in my constituency? What do I do in this situation? Should the state have to force me to go out and do this thing? You could make the libertarian approach. That's the question. And there's a very good counter argument you could make to this. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to just give you the answer, because the stream is so laggy at the moment. It's so behind that it's quite difficult to for everyone to catch up. So the counter to this point is that you could go to the voting polls, but you could just spoil your ballot. That could be an argument that you would make. Okay, so you don't have to vote for a particular candidate, but as long as you've turned out and gone to a poll and you have gone and spoiled your ballot, you just scribble all over it or write a poem or something. Okay, this could be a way to do this. So voting is a civic duty and you don't align yourself with the party, you're not inclined to vote. So if voting is a civic duty and you don't align yourself with a party, You're not inclined to vote, wasting your vote. You're not inclined to vote, wasting your vote as you. It could make the government less legitimate. That's true. That's a good point. So you could make the argument. That if you are forced to vote with someone that you don't really believe in, I don't particularly like this candidate, then to what extent do they have a mandate if they win an election? That's a good point. But if you go to spoil your ballot, then the turnout has still increased. But then again, a counter to that point is to what extent do we have a mandate, a legitimate government? But generally speaking, there's a very good argument that is made that people who go out to spoil their ballot often just go and vote for a candidate anyway. So having a compulsory system. So this is a good example to look at for Australia, because Australia have compulsory voting, and generally speaking, if you go out and you're not particularly political, when it comes to an election time, you might just go out and vote for a particular candidate, regardless of how political you are. Just because you went out there, you made the effort to go to the polls, so you might as well go and do a democracy, go and do a vote. Now, another counterpoint you can make is by looking at other ways to increase participation in the United Kingdom. So you can counter the point by suggesting, well, in fact, there are probably other ways in which we can participate in politics in the United Kingdom. So what are the other ways people could participate in politics? So ways could people participate? That's the point. If I ever have a question, I'm going to put it in the chat as well, just so it catches up quicker. So, thinking about other ways in which people would be able to participate in politics, there are 2 points that you could make. There are 2 points you could do it. Would having pressure groups, informal participation in social media protests and pressure groups? Absolutely. All of these are brilliant examples. So all of these are brilliant examples from everyone here. Okay, so increasing participation through pressure groups. Okay, that increases participation in politics. You can have informal participation, things like social media. Okay, you can have protests. You can go to pressure groups. Okay, you could go canvassing for particular candidates. So you could go and knock on doors to get people out to canvassing when elections come around. Okay, you can have increasing referenda. Hang on. Increasing referendums. Increasing the number of referendums is a very good one. You could have more referendums, because that will then, between the years where you have elections, you can break that up by having referendums. Okay, all of these are party meetings as well. Yeah, all of these are brilliant examples that you could use. To suggest, well, on one hand, yes, compulsory voting and lowering the voting age might be a way of doing it, but on the other hand, why don't we just do all of these things? Why don't we just encourage participation through pressure groups? Why don't we encourage social media participation? Why don't we encourage mass protests? Why don't we encourage political education? I think you could make the argument, Dominic, yes, joining a pressure group, you can make the argument that all of you here who are studying politics at A-level could constitute being involved within politics, participating in politics. Just being able to study this as a subject and to be informed on it is a way in which people can participate within the political system. I've got one more point I want to make on this question before we move on to the next question, and that is something about digital democracy. So So the question you could ask is, what could you talk about if you wanted to bring in the idea of digital democracy? Take a drink, and then, because digital democracy, what we mean by digital democracy is things like electronic voting, using an app to vote, using an app to vote in referendums and elections. Wouldn't that increase participation? It would be unfair for older people. That's a very good point. You could make the argument that it would be unfair for older people due to generation gaps. Exactly. Older people tend not to use newer technology. Okay, but couldn't you have a system? Couldn't you have a system where you have the option to vote via a digital system? So maybe have the option to vote online, but still have in person, still have in-person elections too. Stimulate participation from the 18 to 24 bracket, which generation is lowest turnout. Exactly. When I was 16, 17 years old, or even when I was 18 to 24, okay, you could make the if I had an app where I could just on election day click for the candidate that, log in and click for the candidate that I wanted to, okay, you could. I probably would have done that rather than go out to the polls. That's a very good point. However, what about double proxy voting making it unfair? Yeah. Now, this is the point that we have to make before we finish. I'm going to link a video by somebody on YouTube, okay, who talks about the idea of electronic voting. Because all of these things sound nice, okay, it would increase participation for younger generations. It would stimulate participation within the 18 to 24 bracket, which is generally the lowest turnout. It would be a lot easier. Okay, everybody would just be voting at home. You could still have a system. You could still have a system you could still have a system where you can vote in person as well. But generally speaking, the issue of hacking, okay, the issue of accidentally clicking on the wrong candidate, exactly, okay, the issue of fraudulent ballots, okay, with double voting and proxy voting making the result unfair, exactly, all of these things mean that so while digital voting sounds good on paper, it's a very difficult thing to implement. It's very difficult to implement. Okay, that's really the point. You could go back and forth. You could say that in theory that it's a good idea, but in reality it probably isn't. And that's what this video here by Tom Scott looks at why it's actually a really bad idea, and he goes into a lot of detail. Okay, so before we move on to the next question, I was going to do a quick 5-minute break, but we're going to move on to the next question quickly. Very hard to enforce. Yes, very hard to enforce. Exactly. These are all very, very good points. These are all very, very good points. It's very hard to enforce. It's very hard. There's so many things wrong with it as an idea, but in practice, there's so many things wrong with it. In theory, it sounds like a brilliant idea. The idea that we can just sit at home and use an election app to vote for a candidate, but in reality, it's not necessarily a good idea. Okay. Yes. So overall, it would increase participation as middle-aged people right now will be easily in the future. Yeah. If we could have a system where this worked, theoretically, this could be one of the biggest ways in which you can participate in politics. Well, increase participation. It's an incredible way in which you can increase participation. However, we have the problem of dealing with all the issues beforehand, dealing with the clicking for the wrong person, dealing with hacking, because an election in a first world country with a GDP like the United Kingdom, an election of this size, or even in America, for example, there's potentially trillions and trillions of pounds, or trillions and trillions of dollars at stake with these elections, because economic reform is something that is done at a government level, obviously. So there would be a lot of interest in being able to hack an electoral system like that. So you'd have to be very, 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 very rigorous in ensuring that it doesn't get hacked. And don't forget, you've got politicians like Trump who argued that there was widespread voter fraud in an election where there wasn't any apps, there wasn't anything like that. Imagine what Trump would have done if you had electronic voting on an app. It would be incredible. The amount of fraud claims he'd bring about. Are these questions? No. So let's move on to the next question. Which is assess the impact of the reforms that have been made to the UK's constitution since 1997. Now, this again is a very nice question. I think we can all agree this is a very nice question. So let's have a look at how we are gonna break this down. So really, there's plenty of stuff you can talk about in this question. Everybody who is studying politics at EdXL or AQA at A level should be able to tell me a number of different points you could make when we're talking about constitutional reform since 1997, because there's just so much stuff we can talk about. Not only do we have the New Labour politics, but you also have Conservative politics under David Cameron, and then we have under Theresa May and Boris Johnson. Actually, we've had three. Gosh. So what I would recommend is we present this argument by analysing the changes made in specific aspects of the UK Constitution. So this is how we should structure this question, okay? And I'll talk about what I mean. So we should have a question. If we have a question like this, we should structure this question by, one, talking about a paragraph about one specific topic, okay? Two, a paragraph about a different specific topic, and so on and so on. So we're going to do a paragraph on, for example, parliamentary reform. We could do a paragraph on Human Rights Acts, and we could do a paragraph on judicial reform. We could do a paragraph on devolution. We could do a paragraph on electoral reform. We could do a paragraph on Brexit, and we definitely will be, don't you worry. So we can talk about and we can analyse them separately like that. So let's start by looking at parliamentary reform. I will talk about and discuss other ones as well afterwards. So let's talk about parliamentary reform. So what kind of parliamentary reforms have there been? So what kind of parliamentary reforms have there been? What can we talk about? There are two. We can mainly talk about one specific chamber when we're talking about parliamentary reform. So when we're talking about reform to Parliament, the most significant reforms made since 1997 have been made by way of the House of Lords. Reform to the House of Lords have been the most significant. Okay, so let's talk about the different ways in which the House of Lords have made reforms. Yes, House of Lords reforms, and I will be talking about the Human Rights Act in the Supreme Court in a minute as well. So the House of Lords Act, okay, and specifically birthright conditions as well. So what did the House of Lords Act do? What did the House of Lords reform do? So what did these reforms do? That's the question, because we can't just name. In planning this, we can just name a type of reform, but let's go into a little bit more detail. Let's examine it in a bit more detail, what these reforms actually did to the House of Lords. Oopsie daisy. I'm losing my notes. Hang on. There we go. Okay. What did these reforms actually do? Well, reduced the inherited peers and increased life peers. Yes, that is the point. That is the point. Okay. So the House of Lords Act reduced the number of hereditary peers to 92. So there was only to 92 peers that were hereditary peers. Okay. They also ended the birthright condition to sit in the legislature. So effectively, there will only ever be 92 hereditary peers from now on. So not only did it remove all but 92, but there will only always ever be 92 hereditary peers, unless they change it again. So there will never be any new hereditary peers added into the House of Lords, which is what is the important point to be made. Okay. So the powers. Did they make House of Lords more weaker in terms of power? Well, sort of. So we could talk about this case. We could talk about Jackson and Attorney General. Now, effectively, when it comes to the powers of the House of Lords compared to that of the Commons, the majority of the powers of the shift in power came from the Parliament Acts of 1902? 1911, sorry. 1911. I don't know why I said 1902. 1911 and 1949. But what Jackson and Attorney General effectively did was it basically reinforced the view that the House of Lords is subservient to the House of Commons. That's really all you need to know about that. If you want, I have a video on parliamentary sovereignty from a legal aspect, specifically a legal aspect, where we go into the Jackson and Attorney General case in a lot more detail. But in terms of what New Labour did in a political sense, the removal of 92 hereditary peers, the ending of the birthright to sit in the legislature, why is this not really that good? What kind of criticisms could you make? So what criticisms could you make about House of Lords reform? What criticisms could you make about House of Lords reform? Because don't forget, you can't just list a number of points that are good and then not critically assess and analyse. If you want to get the high grades, you want to have to go back and forth in the argument. What kind of criticisms could we talk about? There's only really one criticism you could effectively, well, a couple of criticisms you could make in this case. Let me go down here. So, mainly the criticism that I would argue, a counterpoint to this, really nice House of Lords reform, is that it didn't really go any further. Okay, there hasn't been much significant reform since then. It's still undemocratic. Yeah, in some instances, it takes precedent over House of Commons. Yeah, it does. In some cases, yes, both of those are true. So in some cases, yes, it does take precedence over the House of Commons, despite the fact that it is an undemocratic body. Constitution. To an extent, you can argue that you're removing experienced members, which benefit the Constitution. But at the same time, someone could make the counterpoint to that, which is that the House of Lords has over 800 plus members in it, and by removing all the hereditary peers, what we're effectively removing is the kind of nobility within the House of Lords, removing the aristocracy. But you could make the argument that while it was good that it reduced down to 92 hereditary peers, it hasn't done much since. We haven't really seen much House of Lords reform since. Okay, and there are definitely, these being only initial changes, there are definitely calls for even more reform. Okay, you could make the argument that people like Nigel Farage, for example, love him or hate him, calls for an abolition of the House of Lords. Okay. So Nigel Farage has called in the past for an abolition of the House of Lords. It doesn't benefit the Constitution. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. I'll say. So I got confused about your point. Yes, it doesn't benefit the Constitution. So there have been claims that we should abolish the House of Lords, or at least make it fully democratic, a fully democratic institution. Because really, what the House of Lords is quite a you could argue is quite a stuffy, aristocratic institution from the past. That it hasn't really, it really needs to come back into the 21st century and become more democratic. Interesting that Nigel Farage calls for an abolition of the House of Lords. It'll be very interesting to see if he accepts a peerage if he was offered one. Now he has left politics for good. That's the point that you could make. Okay, so some people say that the House of Lords should be an elected body. Some people say it should be abolished entirely. Whatever your view on this is, the House of Lords, we really want to see some more parliamentary reform in terms of the House of Lords. Okay. Before we move on to the next paragraph, what other kind of reform could you talk about? Relating a little bit more to the House of Commons. So what other reforms? So what other reforms have been made to the legislature? To the legislature. I'm trying to spell and talk at the same time. It's not necessarily a good idea. So what other reforms to the legislature could we talk about? We need to be quick as well. We don't want to run over. So if we're talking about reforms to the legislature, you could talk about the Fixed Term Parliament Act. The Fixed Term Parliament Act established a system by way of fixing elections to be every 5 years, or if there was ever a snap election called, which it turns out there's been a lot of. But the Fixed Term Parliament Act regulated that when elections to the House of Commons would take place. All Women's Shortlist, yes, the All Women's Shortlist is also a very good example of legislation. They should have a reform to remove Jacob Rees-Mogg from ever stepping foot in the House of Commons. Well, you could make that argument. You could make that argument if you wanted to. So, yes, there are other reforms you could talk about. You could also talk about, you could also put that in a separate paragraph on electoral reform. But it seems as there's so much you can talk about on this question, we can move on to a different kind of point. And let's move on to human rights and judicial reform. So human rights. What human rights / judicial reforms have there been? So, obviously, everybody should be able to get a point on this very, very quickly and very, very easily. So what kind of human rights / judicial reforms can we talk about? Well, of course, we can talk about the Human Rights Act. Introduction of the Human Rights Act in 1998. It was passed in 1998, and I believe it came into force in 2000. The Human Rights Act, effectively what the Human Rights Act does, because there's a little bit of confusion about what the Human Rights Act does. The kind of rights that we have under the Human Rights Act existed before the Human Rights Act was put into place. All the Human Rights Act did was incorporate the vast majority, the vast majority of the provisions from the European Convention on Human Rights into UK law. So previously, before the Human Rights Act, if you wanted to bring about a human rights claim against the government, you'd have to go all the way to Strasbourg, you'd have to pay for it yourself, you'd have to have all of these different things, and it was very unproductive and very slow process. But with the Human Rights Act, it incorporated these laws, these regulations, these human rights, these provisions, into UK law. So you could bring about a claim. So effectively, it allowed for what we call direct effect. You could bring about a claim in a UK court against the United Kingdom's UK government. Okay. Now, there's always been tension about the Human Rights Act. So did it just bring judicial review to UK courts? Effectively, so judicial review is a very complicated issue within public law. So what the Human Rights Act did was it allowed for you to bring a case of judicial review effectively into UK courts. Why is the UK still with the ECHR? Well, because we like human rights in the UK. What do you mean? Human rights are generally a good thing. We've always been a part of the ECHR. Don't get the ECHR confused with the European Union. Okay, ECHR is not part of the European Union. The European Union has its own charter on human rights that we've left. Okay, but the ECHR is a separate part of separate to the European Union. This is one of the common mistakes that was made when we were talking about Brexit and when it came to the referendum in 2016. A number of people argued, if we leave the European Union, then we'd leave the ECHR. That's not true. We don't. They're not the same thing. They're separate. What criticisms can you make about the Human Rights Act? But couldn't the UK make a flexible version of the Human Rights Act? What do we mean by flexible? What do we mean by flexible? What do we talk about when we talk about flexible? Because we're now going to talk about the criticisms of the Human Rights Act. What are the problems the arguments that people have made to critique the Human Rights Act? Okay, because there are a few. And there are a lot of tensions that that take place between Human Rights Act, privacy abuse. I'm not sure what you mean. If you can explain it a bit, explain to me a little bit more. Counter-terror. Okay, so these are generally. Are you trying to bring about? Are you trying to talk about criticisms of the Human Rights Act? Because that's what we're going to talk about now. Okay. So there's been a lot of tension with the Human Rights Act when it comes to calling for its abolition. Okay. So want to remove counter-terrorism obstacles. Yeah. So this is the important point. A lot of people have made arguments. One which gives the UK Parliament legislative control over it. Okay. So there have been a number of arguments against the Human Rights Act. Okay. So one thing that should be noted for one is that the Human Rights Act is only an act of Parliament, for one. Okay. Which means that it's still limited by the principle of parliamentary sovereignty, the principle that Parliament cannot bind its successor. So if our Conservative government right now, okay, if the Conservative government right now wanted to abolish the Human Rights Act, it wanted to get rid of it, and it had the votes to do so, it could do. This is something it could do. Okay. The media should have the right to film celebrities. If you look at the Emma Campbell case and Daily Mail, you'll understand what I mean. Yeah. So, there's an argument there when we're talking about privacy abuse. Privacy abuse falls the right to privacy and an infringement on one's privacy is referred to as in tort, which is a type of law. Okay, the law of tort. Okay. So it's slightly separate to human rights issues. However, you can bring up human rights when we're talking about tort cases. Big fan of the work, my brethren. Keep it up. Thank you, Scott. So what other points that could be made here? Okay. Oopsie daisy. So it's only an act of Parliament, and it has been limited by the fact that Parliament can only bind its successors. That's a very good point. You've also got people who argue that For one, the Human Rights Act has allowed for a lot of tension between the government and the Supreme Court, because of the terrorism, and the Terrorism Act is a very good example. There's also people who would call for the abolition of the abolition of the Human Rights Act, because it has too much of an impact on asylum cases. Now, this is a very, very, very controversial point, which I do not agree with at all. Could you go over some of the cases, some examples, like cases over the pros and cons of the Human Rights Act? Yeah, well, we're going to talk about the Human Rights Act pros and cons. We're just doing that now, briefly, but I will definitely go over it in a separate video if you want. So, obviously, there has been a lot of people who have argued that the Human Rights Act has too much of an impact on asylum cases. Okay, now this is something that I disagree with completely, but this is one argument that has been made against the Human Rights Act. You could even talk about the Human Rights Acts and the new undermining of the Human Rights Act with new emergency powers enshrined following COVID-19. Okay, so COVID-19 has had an impact. So COVID-19 has had an impact on human rights. Okay. Whether or not you agree, whether or not these restrictions on human rights are necessary or not, some would argue that they are, and some would argue that they're not. They've still had an impact, and the most perfect example, if we're going to be talking about the most relevant examples, we could talk about the right to peaceful protest and the vigil that took place at the weekend for the murder victim Sarah Everard. Okay, there's been a lot of calls for the allowing of peaceful protest in the UK, despite the fact that we have emergency powers under COVID-19, and despite the fact that the pandemic is still going on. We have this tension between peaceful protest, the right to peaceful protest, which is enshrined in the Human Rights Act and the ECHR, and this protection under COVID-19. So you could talk about that as well. If you really wanted to go into a lot of detail, you could talk about that. Let's talk about other judicial reform. The Constitutional Reform Act. So what the Constitutional Reform Act did was it increased the separation of powers by establishing a Supreme Court and reforming the role of the Lord Chancellor. We know this. This was in 2005. So Constitutional Reform Act of 2005. Okay, the Supreme Court was put into place in 2009, and we have established a Supreme Court. It also changed the role of the Lord Chancellor. But the problem, a counter-reform to this would be, for the most part, the Constitutional Reform Act was relatively symbolic. Okay, the actual legal role of the Supreme Court and the law lords, hasn't really changed. Okay, so the question you could argue in your essay was the Constitutional Reform Act merely symbolic? Okay. What's the Lord Chancellor? Okay, the Lord. I will link you the video. I'm going to link the video that I have for constitutional reform since 1997, because I talk about the Lord Chancellor in a lot of detail there. Hang on, let me get this down. But effectively, Lord Chancellor, for the purposes of this, the Lord Chancellor was an individual who had held power in all three branches of government. Okay, he was the head of the judiciary. I believe he sat in the cabinet, and I can't remember. I believe he's the Speaker of the House of Lords or something like that. But basically, the role of the Lord Chancellor was somebody who held positions in all three established systems of government, in all three institutions. And obviously, the separation of powers sort of implies that you shouldn't really be allowing people to sit in all three branches of government at the same time. So they, broke up the role of the Lord Chancellor with the Constitutional Reform Act. What's the Constitutional Reform Act, Katie? No, that's fine. The Constitutional Reform Act was an act of Parliament that was passed in 2005, and what it did was it made a number of changes to the judiciary and a number of other different things as well. The most important changes it moved the highest court in the land, which originally sat in the House of Lords. They were called the Law Lords. It moved them to a separate building, now the Supreme Court. Okay, and it also changed the role of the Lord Chancellor, which I just mentioned there. That's what it did. I'm going to link the video that I made on constitutional reform since 1997, just to brush everybody up on this. Let me find it. I'm going to search my channel. It was a long time ago. Hang on. Constitution. Oopsie daisy. It would be good if I could spell. Before we look at Brexit, which is the final one we're going to talk about. Constitutional reform since 1997. Skip advert. Let's link this in the chat. So if you want to brush up on this particular question, this is the video that I made on constitutional reform since 1997. The final one. If you do not talk about Brexit, then you're really missing the mark, because Brexit is a huge one you could talk about. So probably the most significant constitutional reform since 1997. So that's my opinion anyway. Probably the most significant reform since 1997 is definitely Brexit. Okay. Now we know what Brexit is. Vote for a vote to leave the European Union in 2016. In 2020, we officially left the European Union. I believe it was January 2020. There was lots of celebration in Westminster, in London, around that. There were a lot of fireworks around. There were fireworks where I lived as well. Okay, but the rules of the European Union were still established. We still had to follow those rules throughout the year of 2020, because we had entered a transition period, which was this is what's mandated within Article 50, and the transition period was really a period where we would decide the kind of relationship we would have with the European Union afterwards, the kind of trade deal. And in 2021, towards the end of that's wrong. That's really wrong. Hang on. In 2020, at the end of 2020, we had a trade deal. Okay, let's just go here. Okay. At the end of 2020, we agreed a trade deal with the European Union. Why Brexit? Why Brexit was the most significant constitutional reform? Because Brexit effectively changed our entire relationship with the European Union. We had been a member of the European Union since the 1970s. Okay, the European Union law had been integrated into our constitution since then. Okay, we were part of the single market. We were part of the common, economic single market. We were part of Euratom, the European Atomic Agency. We were a part of their common defence policy. Okay, we traded with other countries on the basis of the European Union, through the European Union, and then we just left the European Union like that. Okay, so it's incredibly important, significant constitutional reform, and it allegedly brought back parliamentary sovereignty. Now, criticisms you could make, obviously, about this point, about its significance, was to what extent was Brexit a good thing? To what extent did Brexit bring about positive constitutional change in the United Kingdom? That's really the question. Can't we still copy EU law or just label it British? I mean, we could copy EU law and say it was British, but that would sort of defeat the purpose of some of the arguments that were made against the European Union in the first place. A number of arguments about the referendum was that we want to control our own fishing, we want to control our own laws, we want to control our own immigration policy as well, and if we were just to completely replicate all of the EU laws and label them British, then that would defeat the purpose. But it would also it would also we still wouldn't be part of the single market. Okay, so the single market, the EU single market, is a significant it's a significant part of the European constitution, and what it effectively does is it allows for the free movement of goods across borders. It allows for the free movement of people across borders. It allows for you to establish companies in different countries, no matter where where you come from in the European Union. It allows for the free movement of capital, and it allows for you to provide services in different countries as well. Okay, and even if we had a lot of EU laws that were just labelled British, we still wouldn't be part of the single market. That's the problem. I will make a video on Brexit when we get round to it, okay? So, I will make a video on Brexit. Because Brexit is something that you should really be talking about a lot when we're talking about EU-UK relations and A-level politics at all, when we're talking about the Constitution. Is the Human Rights Act 1998 still an European Convention of Human Rights? Yes, the Human Rights Act. So the Human Rights Act and the European Convention of Human Rights are two different things. They are separately integrated. Okay, so they are separate. They are separate to the European Union. Okay, I find it quite confusing. Well, Brexit is confusing. Katie, 90% of people who voted in the referendum don't understand the European Union, so don't worry about it. It's fine. I don't understand it fully. So, yes, the Human Rights Act and the European Convention of Human Rights is separate to the European Union. They're different things. So by leaving the European Union, we haven't left the ECHR. Those are two different things. Okay, so we've effectively come to an end of these questions. Okay, I'm going to answer a couple more questions if anybody wants to stick around. But for now, that is the end of these two questions. These questions will be uploaded afterwards. Okay, we'll upload them afterwards as separate videos. I hope everyone's enjoyed watching this stream. Okay. David Cameron argued that the UK should rebrand, make the flexible version there. I'll talk about that in a separate. I thought the ECHR and the Human Rights Act were the same thing. They're technically the same. So what the ECHR, the European Convention on Human Rights, what the Human Rights Act did was incorporate most of the provisions from the ECHR into UK law. That's basically what they did. Okay, that's effectively what it did. Okay, so what are the impacts of the UK staying in the ECHR? What are the impacts of the UK staying in the ECHR? Not really anything. Nothing's really effectively changed when it comes to the UK staying in the ECHR. We'll have to see whether or not we leave the ECHR under this Conservative government. There has been talks that we might leave the ECHR. We don't really know. So I'll answer any questions after the stream is done in the chat if anybody wants any more questions. But for now, I'd like to thank everyone for coming and watching. These videos will be uploaded afterwards. If you're studying A-level history, I'm doing a stream tomorrow for Tsarist and Communist Russia. Yes, we did have human rights protections up until 1998, but what we had to do was, if we wanted to fight against the human rights protections, we'd have to go to Strasbourg, where the ECHR is, in order to do that. But what the Human Rights Act did was it made the ECHR, the laws and regulations in the ECHR, it incorporated them into UK law. So we could actually, so I could go to a UK court now, and have my case heard. Okay, so I'll answer any questions. If you want to stay in the chat, answer any questions. But for now, I'm going to end the stream. Thank you very much. Thanks for hosting this. Really helped me out. Thank you very much. We'll be doing this every single week at this exact time. I'll see you all next week.